Welcome to Wine Soundtrack USA. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world in 30 answers. Discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Allison Levine, and today I am sitting in the vineyards of Lenne Estate in the Willamette Valley with owner Steve Lutz. Steve, welcome, and thank you for joining us. And please tell us about Lenne.
Well, thanks for having me. We're a small family-owned business that's established in 2000 on a little 20.9-acre site right in the heart of the Willamette Valley.
And how many acres do you have planted up here?
Well, we have 15 and a half in fruit, 5 different clones of Pinot Noir, and a little bit of Chardonnay as well. And
what does that translate to in wine production?
Well, we only make about 1,600 cases a year, give or take. We sell a little bit of fruit to another winery I've had a long-standing relationship with.
And are you selling any fruit, or everything goes into bottle?
No, we just sell a little bit of fruit to a winery called Owen Rowe, and I've had a relationship with them that goes back to 2005 now. So we continue to do that, but everything else we put in bottle.
And where are your wines available?
Primarily right through the tasting room or online. We are mostly a direct-to-consumer producer, although we do sell a little bit of wine in in Denver, and we sell a little bit of wine in Maryland, and we have sold a little bit of wine in Chicago in the past. Wouldn't mind selling a little bit there and maybe in New York, but we primarily sell most of our wine right out of our tasting room.
And Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are your two things?
Those are our two main varieties.
Perfect for the Willamette Valley.
We are, yeah. We're actually working on, this year, just a fun little pet project. We're working on a barrel of sweet vermouth made from Pinot Noir.
Wow.
Don't ask me, it's still a work in progress, but it should be fun. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Wow. Okay. So tell me, what is one of your first memories relevant to wine?
Well, the first memory with wine, something I always remember, is the first time a dry wine made any kind of sense to my palate. And this was in college. A girlfriend's brother took us out to dinner and ordered this bottle of French Burgundy. And it was a kind of a low-level French Burgundy from Macon. And for the first time, I thought, oh, I see why people like these dry wines. And I think we were having some kind of fish dish, and I thought, this kind of makes sense to me. So that really started my whole interest in wine. That was the first time it made any kind of sense to me, and ever since I've been a big fan.
So as you went on the pursuit of finding more good dry wines, is there one particular wine, a memorable wine that stood out and the occasion to which you drank that?
Oh, gosh, there's been a lot of them, but that's really...
I know, it's a tough question.
That's a hard one to pinpoint. I will say that probably there's been so many wines that have stood out for different reasons and different occasions, but I've always been driven by Pinot Noir. So my most memorable wines have almost always been Pinot Noir. And one of the most memorable wines I ever had, not necessarily because I was enamored with it, but I got to taste of extremely old Pinot Noir from the Napa Valley, actually from the late 1800s.
Wow.
That was when I worked for Inglenook, and so that was an 1892 Inglenook Pinot Noir, and smelled just like coffee is the best way I could describe it.
Wow. So sounds like you came from California. You were working in the wine business before you came up here. What drove you up to the Oregon area?
Well, interestingly enough, I went to school in Oregon at University of Oregon, and then after school, I was trying to find something to do. I ended up back up in my home state of Colorado, and just started drinking wine and started liking wine. And I had a small kind of service job in an oil company. And I thought, I know what I want to do with my life. And so I packed up my car one day and I moved to the Napa Valley. And I've been in it ever since.
And have you spent time traveling around the world tasting wines?
I don't know about around the world. I have been to France several times. In fact, we were just in Burgundy recently. We took the wine club on a float trip down the Rhone River. And before, we took them to Burgundy for 3 days. So I've been to different areas in Burgundy, but really most of my interest in wine has stemmed in a large part from Pinot Noir. And so Burgundy's the natural place. I have been to the Loire. I've been to southern France a couple times. But really, other than that, it's just been California.
And so if we were to go into your wine cellar and see what you have, I'm not asking how large it is, but what would we find in there? A lot of California, Oregon, anything else? Any unique varieties?
Well, you would find, I forgot to say, I have been to New Zealand. So you would find some New Zealand Pinot Noirs in there. You certainly would find a lot of Oregon wine in there. You would also find some European wines. I mean, I certainly like Burgundies. I like to collect some Burgundies. I do have a little bit of Spanish wine. I can't say I'm a huge fan of Spanish wine. I like them sometimes, but we sold a little bit of wine in Spain for a while, which is a very long, convoluted story. But we had a very good reception in Spain, and they really loved the wine. So I took a trip there and came back with a couple cases. So I haven't drank any of those yet. So, but I have a really eclectic wine cellar, like a lot of other people, with lots of onesies and twosies of things. I'm not a collector. I'm a drinker. So I like to collect wines to drink. But I will say, Oregon Pinot Noir really demands cellar time, and probably makes the bulk of my cellar.
And anything in particular right now that you're drinking out of that cellar? A bottle you opened recently?
Yeah, the 2007s. Love the 2007s. They're delicious right now. It was a year that was really panned by the critics, and to be fair, nobody really understood it when they came out. They were very hard. They were somewhat hard, austere wines. We had rain all through harvest that year, and so people really didn't understand what those wines were going to turn into. And I think it was a learning experience for certainly the media, and also even for vintners. We learned that you can really make great wines from poor vintages. They never show well in the beginning, but in the end, they end up being some of my favorite wines.
So you're obviously a big fan of Pinot Noir, as you've expressed, and that's what you're growing. Do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety, and does Pinot Noir qualify?
Boy, that's a really tough one. It's certainly not the perfect variety to grow and make, because it is more temperamental, but it's one of the three so-called transparent varieties. So I do think that it takes on terroir. It reflects terroir more so than maybe some other varieties. It is definitely more transparent. I mean, we don't have, Pinot Noir doesn't have, although ours are fairly full-bodied Pinot Noirs, they don't have kind of the body that some other varieties have that can mask other things in the wine. So I do think it's the most flavorful variety from my standpoint when they're aged properly. There's nothing I'd rather drink. So moving on to what people should drink and what people do drink, what is your opinion on critics and scores? Oh, that's a good one. You don't ever want to ask a winemaker that. If they're honest, you're gonna get some interesting answers. I'll tell you, here's the deal. I used to think, I heard another vintner say this, another local colleague of mine say this a few years back, and I thought he was spot on. He said critics were really important back when there were a lot of flawed wines around, and I agree, because they were grabbing the good wines and pointing them out. But now there's really not a lot of flawed. Science has elevated winemaking worldwide, so there's not a lot of flawed wines around. And so I think that critics are more just giving you their palate impressions of wines, and your palate impression may or may not agree with them. I think when a critic gives one wine a 94 and another wine a 92, and it's really, and people kind of look at those and think those are really quality judgments, I think they're mistaken. I think they're more impression of the wine. So, yeah, I think critics certainly important. They certainly guide people to wines, but I think people should really keep an open mind about a critic's judgment when they're making a decision to buy a wine.
Mm-hmm. So for you as a wine drinker and the decisions you make, red, white, or rosé?
Well, I like them all. But red is the most complex. But I can't. And I have a lot of people who come here and they'll say, I don't try any white wine. I'm just interested in red wine. And I think, wow, it would be really weird to have a life without having white wine in it, because it's so important at certain times. There's certain times that it's the only thing that could satisfy me is a nice white wine. So I love white wines, and I like rosés are fun, but red wine is the most complex ultimately.
And still or sparkling?
Definitely still, unless it's very good sparkling. If it's really high-end grower champagne from France, then I'm in on it. And I would say, certainly Oregon's making better and better sparkling wine. I think Oregon has, really potential to make world-class sparkling wine, and it's certainly moving that direction. And we've thought about playing with it here a little bit. But generally, I'm more interested in still wine.
And talking about different wines for different times and, where we have different moods and different flavors, how do you approach food and wine pairing? Do you think that there are hard and fast rules that you have to follow, that the traditional roles of white with fish and red with meat apply, or how do you approach it?
I think there are. It's kind of vogue to say, oh, we can do any wine with anything. But there are some traditional rules that follow. I don't like tannic wines with fish. They just make no sense at all. It makes that they taste metallic, and it doesn't do anything for fish. Pinot Noir is one of the few wines I think you could pair well with certain types of fish. Pinot Noir and salmon is a classic Northwest food and wine pairing, but it has to be the right kind of Pinot Noir. Our Pinot Noirs generally are a little bit too big for the most part to be paired with salmon, although we have had wines that certainly could, especially when they're young. But I just enjoy, I enjoy pairing, I really enjoy pairing wine with food in general, especially, here's one thing I will say about it. The more complex the wine, the simpler the food. If you have a real complex wine and you have a food with a lot of complexity and different flavors, it's really hard to make that work. So I think if you've got a great bottle of red wine, nice cut of meat, keep it somewhat simple. If it has a lot of spice or exotic things, that's when you can start to get into issues. A lot of people love wine and chocolate. Red wine and chocolate. I'm not a big fan of it, but it's to each your own. If you like that, more power to you. Again, that's a very hard pairing because you have to make sure that it's really bittersweet chocolate. Otherwise, it's going to make the wine taste sour. So, I think I'm all about experimentation. If I'm having Thai food, I have to have a Gewürztraminer or a Riesling if I'm not having beer. But generally, I love to have a Gewürztraminer or Riesling. So that's one of my favorite wine and food pairings.
So we're sitting out here in the beautiful vineyard looking at the vines that are growing quickly in a beautiful view of the valley. For someone who hasn't had the chance to visit, who hasn't had the chance to taste your wines, what are they missing out on?
Well, it depends on their level of sophistication in drinking wine. I think that to bring somebody out to the Willamette Valley who's not really a wine drinker, they're going to love the scenery. Going from taster to taster and tasting wines, they might have a little hard time understanding them unless they have them paired with some food. Because in the beginning, they can be somewhat acidic, especially in cool vintages. But if you understand Pinot Noir a little bit, you're going to get a good education here if you're open and ask some questions. We have these Oregon Pinot Noirs are really coming into their own. The wine quality here, I've watched the wine quality change over the last 50 years. I used to get these wines all the time when I was in Napa Valley. We used to do Pinot Noir blind tastings, and the quality difference today is staggering from what you would have had 30 years ago. So the wine quality is really up there, and if you're lucky enough to be here at a particular vintner that has some older Pinot Noirs to taste, we occasionally do here. We usually hold back one wine and bring it out in the summer. This summer we didn't do it because the 13 we were going to bring out I didn't feel was ready, so we're going to bring it out next summer. But if you're lucky enough to try an older wine, that really makes a huge difference. You really start to understand what Pinot Noir is all about, because they get this beautiful velvety texture that you can only get through bottle age with Pinot Noir, and there's no better place to enjoy something like that than here in the Willamette Valley.
So if space aliens were to come join us, land here right on your rooftop where we're sitting right now, which of your wines would you present to them and why?
Well, this is a good question. I always tell people you're seeing a wine at one point in time, and people always ask me what's my favorite wine, and I say, well, you don't understand that it's very hard to pick that now, because I know that a year from now you might have a favorite wine, but if you come back, that could be turned on its head because another wine might just not have opened up yet. So right now we have a 2014 Pinot Noir, and this is really a good example of a wine that a year ago I would sit and drink this wine. I knew where it was headed, but a really nice vintage, and I knew where this wine was headed, but I wouldn't often sit with a bottle and really savor it. And over the past 3 months, I would be embarrassed if I told you how much of this I've drunk. It's really turned a corner this year and changed. And right now, this is my go-to wine.
The 2014 Pinot Noir.
It's not our most expensive wine right at the moment, but it is definitely my go-to wine.
I'm sipping it right now, so if that's the welcome wine to a space alien, I think that's a good choice.
Exactly.
Wine Soundtrack, the voice of American wine growers and makers.
So your vineyards are right here on your property. I'm sure you spend a lot of time in your vineyards. You said you've been here for a good decade or so. Would you say that over the years, with vintage variation, I mean, we know every vintage tells a different story, but in a place like this, do you find more variation from year to year or more similarities?
Well, you'd certainly find more variation in Willamette Valley than you would, say, in Napa Valley. No doubt about it. In fact, when I first came here, we used to have a little consternation about that because Napa Valley was so consistent. But after you're here and then you see a difficult vintage like 2007 and you see what happens to those wines and know that you can make great wines in off vintages, and sometimes you're going to even prefer those off vintages to some of the other vintages, you really start to embrace that difference, and you start to embrace the changes every year and the vintage variation. It's not something to shy away from. It's something really to celebrate, I think.
And do you find that there are any sort of predictors that you look for that will help you determine what a vintage is going to be like?
You know, I'll tell you can never call a vintage till right at the end. And even sometimes I have to get in the bottle and then, you know, I've learned that with that 7 vintage. You have to get in the bottle and let it wait 3 or 4 years before you're really going to know. But some vintages you have a really good idea right before harvest that they're going to be really super vintages. We knew for a number of vintages, early vintages, that we were going to have really good vintages, even up to a couple weeks before harvest. But the problem is you can only predict the weather so far out, so you're never quite sure what's going to happen. But I really think that it's getting easier because we're having warmer, earlier vintages now.
Mm-hmm. And with your team, do you have any rituals that you do at the beginning of harvest that kind of that say this is the start of harvest? Any celebrations or traditions or?
Well, sadly to say, no. we do. I have worked at wineries where they actually brought in a priest and he blessed the first bin of grapes. He blessed them,
wow.
and which was kind of entertaining. But we don't here. We're such a small operation that basically for me it's a ritual every year. When I know that I'm going to be up, I just am getting everything prepared, and I'm going to be up at 5:30 in the morning for 3 or 4 days in a row. That's just my ritual. There's just a certain feeling about harvest. When you're growing these grapes, it's all you're really wanting out of harvest, because you've tended them the whole year, is you just don't want bad things to happen. You don't want bad things to happen with weather, but you don't want equipment breakdowns. And so I'm always nervous coming up to a harvest because a lot of things can go wrong.
What kind of relationship do you have with your vines? Do you spend time walking through and talking to them? And if so, what do you say to your vines? Or maybe when it's in the barrel?
I don't talk to them, but I do spend a lot of time with them. This is a little small 15.5-acre vineyard that, I strung all the wire for the trellis here. I've walked these rows many times. I always tell people that thank God I did it when I did it, because now I'm old enough that it would be very difficult. It was really a physical type of job for a long time, and it still is in a lot of ways. Harvest is pretty physical, but I spent a lot of time in the vineyards. The biggest thing is looking at your vines. You really have to looking at not only your vines from right down in them, but looking at them from a distance. We can just look at color variations in the canopy, which are easily show up in a distance to kind of see what parts of your vineyard are stressed and maybe what parts of your vineyards are undergoing too much stress. So you have to get out in them and look at, especially when the fruit sets, you have to look at the clusters, you have to look at the leaves, look at the stalks, see what the mildew issue is, see if you have any mite issues. And then, of course, once the fruit sets, it's all about seeing how much fruit you have, what type of year you're in, how hot it is. Are you going to drop fruit? Are you going to keep more fruit? A lot of decisions that have to be made along the way. So
before you were making all these decisions and having a visual communication with your vines, what did you want to be when you grew up as a little boy?
I wanted to be a professional basketball player. That's what I dreamt about when I was a little kid. Never happened. But thank God I didn't. I was going to be, after I got out of college, I thought I would go to law school, and thankfully things just turned on their heads, and here I am.
Great. So when you're not wandering through your vineyards and running your winery and doing everything that you do, what do you do for fun in your free time? That elusive term, free time.
I'm a golf fanatic. I love the game of golf, so that's probably my biggest. But I love travel and I love to eat and drink, and I used to do a lot more wine travel. I used to love to go, and I still do when I'm in another area. I love to go taste the local wines, and I love to go see what people are doing. And I still like to do that. I don't do as much of it as I used to, but I still enjoy that as well.
And any particular sports teams that you're a supporter of? I mean, you've lived in a couple different states, so I don't know where your loyalties lie.
Oh, but of course. Who doesn't? Well, I'm from Denver, and I'm still a diehard Denver Bronco fan. And I'm a big Portland Trailblazer fan.
So if either of your teams were to win their championships, which wine would you want to present to them?
Well, I'd present my best. We have a wine called Saint Galou, which is the best of the best. It's the 5 best barrels from the vineyard, and that would probably be the winner.
Well, let's hope they win, and then you can present it to them. And for a really romantic evening, what are the wines that you'd be opening up for you and your wife?
Definitely some type of white wine to start, and it'd probably be either be a really, really good our Chardonnay or another really good Oregon Chardonnay or a white Burgundy. I love white Burgundies. And I really like French Gewürztraminer and Rieslings. I love Alsatian wines. So it'd be a really nice white wine to start out with, and then it's going to be Pinot Noir. I can tell you that. And it's going to be an aged Pinot Noir, whether it's from Burgundy or from the Willamette Valley. It's definitely, or California. It's going to be an aged Pinot Noir for sure. So you've obviously, succeeded in your business and done a lot, and there's probably been a lot of advice given to you over the years. Is there one piece of advice that you've carried with you throughout the years, and who shared it with you? Well, I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got was from fellow vintner and somebody that I've had a relationship with since 2005, and I sell some fruit to them, and it's David O'Reilly from a winery called Owen Rowe. And he came up to me in the 2007 vintage, and we had this beautiful growing season. We were sitting there in the middle of September, and the grapes were just about ready, and everybody knew rain was coming. And he came up, and I said, "David, do you think we should pick before the rain?" And he just smiled and laughed at me, and he said, "Rookies always want to pull the trigger too quick." And it always kind of stuck with me about how to make picking decisions. And he is really good at picking decisions based on flavor. And so he really helped me get the confidence to ride out rain, especially in my vineyard, because my vineyard rides it out really well. And so I think that advice always stuck with me, and we've always made our picking decisions based on flavor.
And that's also because you're at a slope, right? With the elevation?
We are. We're at a slope, and we're windy in the afternoon, and so we dry out pretty quickly. And I've never shied away from letting it ride through some.
Now, switching a little bit, if you could offer some advice to our listeners, what piece of advice would you like to share?
In terms of wine consumption, or
anything you like?
Well, I would just say,
words of wisdom.
Okay, my words of wisdom would be open-minded about wines and try wines. Find somebody who is an expert. They may be at a local wine shop. They may be a sommelier somewhere, or just a friend who's really wine knowledgeable. Find somebody who's really wine knowledgeable, and then keep an open mind and keep trying different wines. The only way you learn.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more on that one. Looking back at the accomplishments you've made building this winery and your life in the wine industry, what would you say is one of your proudest achievements to date in your work?
Wow, that's a very good question. I think that for me, it's kind of an overall achievement. Sometimes I just sit here and I look out at the vineyard and what we've done, and I think, how did we get here? I mean, and when I think about all the work, if you knew all the work that went into something like this before you started, you'd never tackle it. So it's just the achievement of having gotten here, and we did it the hard way. We did it without a lot of money. There's that old saying, the way to make $1 million in the wine business, start out with $10 million. We didn't have that. We just started out. It was just a lot of hard work. We had a little bit of money and a lot of hard work, and we eventually made it.
It's great to be able to look back, because when you see these vineyards with full canopies and everything, it's hard to imagine when it was probably trees here that you had to clear and then plant, and 3 years to grow them. And amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so many things that we did to the property, and we're still doing to the property. It never really stops. But it is. I think that's a big accomplishment. But one of the first times I ever tried the wine, and that was the 04 vintage when we had it in the barrel. And I wait till it gets through ML, and in January we tried the wine for the first time. And I'll never forget coming home to my wife, and we had so many issues. We were just writing checks and running out of money, and I remember coming home to her and saying, "You know what? Don't worry about it. It's all going to work out." Because picking the right site is the most important thing, and we were very fortunate. We got an A+ site here, and that makes the biggest difference right there.
So complete this sentence for me. A table without wine is like?
Day without sunshine. To quote Anita Bryant, wasn't that Anita Bryant? Anyway, I can't imagine eating food in the evening without having some water.
So if you could imagine a scenario where somebody was sitting at a table and the paparazzi snapped this image of them sitting at a restaurant, and on that table was a bottle of your wine, who from any walk of life would you want to be drinking your wine?
Well, that's a really fascinating question, and I've never really thought about that. But, I think that somebody who really appreciated great Pinot Noir, because you could say in your mind, oh, I'd like this star, this person to, I've heard of these stars or athletes who are into wine, but I'd want somebody who really appreciated great Pinot. And that was like a real experience to them, not just somebody who didn't really care about the wine, but they were famous or,
right.
Yeah.
So just a Pinot lover.
Exactly.
So do you think that in the next couple hundred years or beyond, we'll still be drinking wine or some version? I mean, where do you think we're going to be in 300 or 500 years?
Yeah, I do, because I think it's the most complex beverage we deal with. And I think that as technology goes forward, we're living in a more technological age. I think wine brings people back to this place where they came from and where they want to be, the land and the terroir. And I think that's a really important thing. And as technology moves forward, people still long for a connection with the earth. And I think wine always gives them that connection with the earth. So I have a hard time. I mean, I hope that we're always drinking wine. I can't imagine a world without it.
Yeah. Well, in the worst case scenario that the world were to end and you were sent to a deserted island and can only take 3 wines with you, what 3 wines would they be?
Well, the 3 best wines that I have in my cellar. Not sure what those would be at the time, but if I could pick and choose...
You can pick and choose.
I would take one of my aged Pinot Noirs with me. Maybe 2, because one wouldn't be enough in the end. And then I would take, I think I would take just a world-class bottle of white Burgundy with me. Because an island's probably warm, and I'll lead with some white wine.
That's true.
Yeah.
But it is your island, so.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm going to play a little game now. We like to pair wine and music. It's called Wine Soundtrack, after all. So based on some of the wines you were just talking about, I just want you to give me a sense of what you'd want to be listening to or what makes you think of. It can be a genre or a singer or a song. But you talked about, and we tasted a little while ago, your 2017 Chardonnay.
Boy, these are really difficult questions you have. Things I've never thought about with wine. 17 Chardonnay, I would probably, certainly sophisticated. So I would say some really sophisticated kind of jazz for that. Maybe some, not funky jazz, but some modern but really good jazz, not Kenny G. Not that he's not,
Fair enough.
Yeah.
What about the 2014 Pinot Noir that we're drinking right now?
That would be, to me, that wine, I might like to just sit with that wine and listen to some good classic rock, like really like nice old classic rock. It's kind of satisfying. That wine's satisfying to me now. So I think that would be kind of a nice combination.
Okay, one more.
Yeah.
If we took one of your older Pinots, going back, 2007, which you said was a difficult vintage that turned out a really good wine, what would you do with it? What would you pair with that?
That would be some type of intense classical music. Maybe, that's like a Bach or Beethoven kind of wine. It's really classical. It's just very high-toned. And
thank you for playing. So, Steve, we're almost finished. I know you said that you travel still, but you're not going as much on a wine-driven thing. But if there was one place in the world that's at the top of your bucket list to travel to, where would it be?
Well, I just did it. I just went to Burgundy, and
yes, you can't beat Burgundy.
So yeah, that was. And then on the flip side, I went to Scotland and played golf. So that was, I hit two of them in one trip, which is. But oddly, in the other place I've always wanted to go is Alsace, and so we're taking the wine club on another trip on a float trip down the Rhine in November of 2020, and we're going to go to Alsace for 3 days before that. So.
Well, good for you for checking that bucket list off.
Yeah. It's a great thing when you can do it. Doesn't happen very often.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today on Wine Soundtrack. And before we go, can you just remind our listeners where they can find you and how they can visit you, when and where?
Well, the best place is to go to our website. It's lenneestate.com, or just Google Lenne Winery and it'll come up, and really has all the relevant information. But we're right in the heart of Yamhill, so if you go to the website, you can get directions and also information on what we offer.
And your tasting room is open 7 days a week?
It's open 7 days a week through the summer. Then we go to Wednesday through Sunday, but open 7 days a week from 12 to 5 right now.
Fantastic. Well, we'll be back. You have a great deck to picnic at and have a little lunch and look out at the views. And thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack USA. For details and updates, visit our website, winesoundtrack.com.